This is Adam Watson,
And Robert Diaz.
and you're listening to the Darkslinger Mafia podcast. I am on another podcast currently, the Comic Collaborative, and I just want listeners to know that I am in no way, shape, or form quitting that podcast. I am actually going to be on both of these podcasts. What's going to differentiate this one from that one is that one mainly tackles working in comics as a collaborative medium, whereas this one is going to be more specific to me as a comic writer and comic publisher and go through more of the day-to-day, week-to-week minutia of running a comic company and creating comic characters. Robert, you don't actually work in the comic industry in any shape or form, but you've been...
I bought comics. That's
You
nearly
have bought
working.
comics? Yeah, nearly. Depending on what you're reading. But you have been one of my confidants for quite some time. You've heard me babble on about comic stuff and business stuff quite a lot.
Quite a lot.
And you've helped me at, what, a dozen or so conventions at this point?
Probably.
Okay, so a little history about Darkslinger Comics. So I first started writing comics in about 2003. And when I first started, I actually thought that I was going to work on other people's properties. So I'm going to say around 2004, somewhere in there, Marvel Comics actually had an open submission policy with a new imprint they were doing, or a revived imprint rather, called Epic Comics, where they were looking for new creators to hire to put onto old existing project or properties and bring them back to life, basically. Marvel had apparently no clue what they were doing with that, though, because it folded after releasing like 2 comics, I think, and they were pretty god-awful comics, too. One of them involved Aunt May actually being Peter Parker's mom, which was kind of gross. But
That's weird.
it was very
It
weird.
would have been funnier if you said that Aunt May was actually Spider-Man.
That would have been better. That would have been a lot better.
People would read that.
Anyway, back then, I thought I was going to work on other people's properties. And when you first start out, it's pretty common that you have other people read your scripts because you're really uncertain of what you're doing. And you just kind of want to know what people think about them. So you like to get a lot of feedback. One of the people that I got feedback from a lot back then was a guy named Russell Roy, who was constantly telling me that I should just start up my own comic company, because in all the scripts I kept writing, I kept creating new characters anyhow, and he thought that this would be something I could do. But basically, I didn't have the balls to do it at first. That's what it all amounts to. Until a year later, when he died. When he died, for some reason, that just kind of sparked a fire in me and made me think life is too short to fuck around. And, you know, I did want to work on my own characters. I did want to own my own characters. So I started up Darkslinger Comics and published my first book, Ghost Assassin, in February of 2006. Since then, I published around 20 books, done hundreds of conventions.
I was in high school.
You were in high school in 2006? What year did you graduate?
I was a freshman in high school. Fat kid that never read anything.
You were a fat kid?
Yeah, I was.
Huh. You can't tell now.
Little chubster. So weird.
I don't think I read anything.
I don't even think I'd really seen a comic at that point in my life.
So how did you get into comics?
It's a good question. I don't know. I think it was Alex, probably.
Okay. Alex is Robert's brother.
I would assume it was him, because I followed him around and did what he did and hung out with him.
Mm-hmm.
And then he took me to a comic shop, I don't know, like 6 years ago.
Okay.
And I hadn't bought anything until then. I don't remember if I knew you at that point. Has it been that long?
Yeah, we've known each other for that long.
All right. Maybe I'd gotten one from you, but the first one I bought was Batman Hush.
Mm-hmm.
Because Sean at Things from Another World suggested it.
Yeah, Batman Hush is great.
It was. And now I have too many. Not quite as many as you, but enough that I need a box to put
Well,
them
I've
in.
also been reading comics since I was 10 years old. So, of course, I'm going to have more than you after 6 years. That's just common sense.
I didn't really read much, though, of anything.
Mm-hmm.
But now I try to steal your stuff.
And you've done quite a few Comic Cons with me and continue to be one of my most frequent helpers at conventions. So what do you think about Comic Cons?
They're entertaining. It's interesting to see all the people that come by.
Mm-hmm.
And in the end, you're just trying to be a salesman back there.
Yes. You've done both comic conventions and horror conventions with me. Because one of the things I do is I like to diversify the type of conventions I'm at. I don't like to just strictly do Comic Cons. When I first started out back in 2006, 2007, I actually did antique shows, toy shows, tattoo conventions, all kinds of things that weren't just Comic Cons. And one of the type of shows that I like to do the most is actually horror conventions, which you've been to CryptCon, which is a horror convention in Seattle, with me 2 or 3 times.
2, I think.
2. And you've been to quite a few Comic Cons at this point. Small Comic Cons. You haven't been to one of the really big shows yet.
No.
But what do you think about the difference of those two types of shows? Which do you like going to best?
They each have their pros and cons. I mean, I like the little shows, like Frankenstein, because you can go get everything there for really cheap.
Yes.
And you can find comics. Horror shows are fun because, you get to go out of town, meet some strange people, get some fun stories.
Mm-hmm.
But you don't see many comics, and you can't buy really anything there. You're more just there for the experience and the exposure.
Yeah. And you don't have as much time to walk around.
Yeah.
Because it's a lot easier to leave your table mate there if they have a little knowledge about a bunch of back issues you're selling, because they'll do a better job of selling themselves since they've been out for a long time. Because that is one of the things I do a lot of, is I do conventions as both a reseller and as a publisher. So it's pretty frequent that I'll take 16 to 20 long boxes worth of comics and trade paperbacks to sell for cheap at a small show, and carve out a little section of the table for the Darkslinger stuff, so that I'm still selling that. That's my main goal, is to sell anything related to Darkslinger at the same time.
It's a lot of shit to lug around.
It is. It's a lot of stuff to lug around. And so when I do a show it's just Darkslinger, it's slightly nicer in just the fact that we have, 4 boxes plus a backdrop versus 16 long boxes and so on and so forth.
What was the third thing you published?
What was the third thing I published?
Yep.
That is a very specific question.
Yeah.
The third thing I published was the Darkslinger Comics Sketchbook Volume 1. Basically, I was going to my first convention. Or no, that was at my second convention.
Which one was your first?
My first as a reseller or as a publisher?
Publisher.
My first as a publisher was a small show in Eugene. I think it was just called the Eugene Comic Book Show. That was in its second and final year in 2006, unfortunately, because I did super well at that show. I got a great response off of Ghost Assassin there. But the next show I did after that, so the first show I did in Eugene with Ghost Assassin, I had Ghost Assassin, the Pauper City on Fire poster, the Ghost Assassin family poster, and the David poster. People loved it there. I didn't sell a ton of the posters. I sold quite a few of the Pauper City on Fire. I didn't sell many of the Ghost Assassin posters there, but I sold through my entire run that I brought of Ghost Assassin Prelude. So I very quickly went back to print. At that time, I was using a really great print-on-demand printer service called Kablam, which, if you don't know what print-on-demand is, it means they use digital technology instead of offset printing, so that they can produce comics in quantities as few as one. So if you're only looking to print up 100 or 200 copies of your book versus like 1,000, 2,000, it can actually be a big money and time saver to just go through a smaller printing service like Kablam. And Kablam, they specialize in comics. So they're who I found to do my first run. And I had sold through everything I had ordered my initial 3 runs by the time I did the Emerald City comic, or not Emerald City, the Eugene comic book show. My first run was only 50 copies, and I ended up selling those all out to family and friends before I even made it to the show. So then I ordered another 100 copies, and people who knew my family and friends ended up buying all of those. So then I did another print run that was for 300 copies, and by the time the Eugene comic book show was over, I'd sold through that print run. So with the Stumptown Comic Fest quickly coming up after the Eugene show, I think they were about a month apart, I figured I better have as much inventory on hand as possible because, clearly this was a really hot commodity I had, right? Look how well I did in Eugene. So I ordered up another 100 or 200, whatever it was, copies of Ghost Assassin. And I had a book called The Pauper, which was actually the first one I'd created, but not the first one I had released, ready to go, but I was not happy with it, and I knew at some point I was going to be revising it. So I decided to kind of release that as almost like a convention edition. I called it the Pauper Rough Cut, and then I explained to people when they were purchasing it that this wasn't going to be the absolute finished product. This was basically more of like a test book, if you will. And I looked at all the files I had for all the comics I had been creating and discovered that I had a lot of black and white work and sketch work and so on and so forth that was never going to get to be seen by anybody. Back in those days, there wasn't anything like Instagram or anything like that you could easily share all of the behind-the-scenes material with people. We had MySpace and Facebook, which is kind of just sort of starting.
It's funny you say back in the day when that was a decade ago.
Right. But a decade ago had no Instagram, no Twitter, no Tumblr. Facebook was barely a blip. MySpace was really super hot, but it's not like you put a lot of pictures like that on there.
The good old days.
Mm-hmm. So I decided to take all of this material and put it out in a form that I could actually sell. So I compiled it all into a sketchbook and, created a cover for it, logo, whole nine, and printed that up along with the Pauper Rough Cut and the reprints of Ghost Assassin Prelude. Took him to Stumptown Comics Fest, and as it turns out, I really shouldn't have dumped that much money prior to going to that show. So the good about that show, it was the first show that I ever met one of my lifetime friends, Alan Benedat. You know Alan. And for those of you who don't know Alan,
he's an old man.
He is an old man, and he's an old man behind Black Box Comics in Portland, Oregon. Comics with an X, not with a CS. That's a different Black Box Comics. Alan does some amazing scratchboard artwork. But anyway, that was the first show that I met him at. And that's pretty much the good of that show. So, the bad... Now, I did end up doing Stumptown several times. And I always found it to be fairly mixed. You either did really well there or really bad. For the bad, number one, I quickly found people at that show, or at least at that particular one, had no interest in buying the type of product I was putting out. Because I had at least 2 people come up to me throughout the course of that day that said the same thing. Your stuff looks amazingly polished. So I said, thanks. Because what else are you supposed to say when somebody says something like that? Sounds like a compliment, right?
You would think.
You would think. And their response to that, both of them, was, I didn't mean that as a compliment. That comic convention, number one, didn't have the type of people at it who wanted to buy the type of stuff I created. These people wanted zines. They didn't want something that looked even remotely mainstream. Number two, they kept turning the lights off on us, which made it very difficult to make sales with the people who might have bought my product.
People in my generation don't know what a zine is.
People in your generation absolutely know what a zine is. You just don't know what a zine is.
Magazine?
No, what a zine is it's generally smaller than a regular comic, but they can go up to pretty much any size. But a zine is, God, how do you even define them? I've never made them, so it's a little bit difficult. What a zine is basically like something that someone's made at like Kinko's, something like that, and they've hand stapled together. And it might not just be comics. It might be like, here's my comic, and here's the article I wrote about why the president sucks. And here's some pictures that I took on vacation. I mean, zines can range because they can just basically be ash can comics, but sometimes it can be like something that everybody just, or someone put everything random happening in their life into.
Yeah, I had no idea.
Yep, they were a big thing at Stumptown Comic Fest. The average price of a comic there was $1 because the majority of the people selling comics there made their stuff at Kinko's, which, if that's the way you do it, that's fine. But that's probably not going to be a good market for me. So these days, if I see the word zine or even indie, I might just stay away from the convention because it's probably not going to be one I'm going to do very well at. And that has not always been the case. I mean, I've done incredibly well at some of the Olympia Comics festivals, which sell themselves in the same way, but seem to attract a different crowd, or at least they used to. So anyway, they kept turning the lights off on us. That was really hard to make sales in the dark. And they kept turning the lights off because they were showing movies on the side of the building they put us in. And apparently the best way they could think to do this was just shut the lights off on the creators who happened to be anywhere near the movie screen, which unfortunately for both Alan and I, we were both in that area. It was a show that had the problem of growing too fast for the people who started it to be able to maintain it. So eventually I think it was taken over by a new crew, but that show got bought by Rose City a couple years ago.
Well, that's how it goes.
Now Stumptown is a part of Rose City as their artist alley.
Yeah, if people don't run the show right, then you end up at a shitty show.
But there were a lot of people who did super well there. It all just depended on what type of product you were selling. My product didn't go over well there, but that's just a lesson learned. And like I said, there were other years that I did Stumptown that I did actually do really well there. It just depends on what type of crowd was coming in. But anyway, of all the copies that I paid to have done specifically for that show, I think I ended up selling maybe 5% of everything. So that was the third thing I published, to answer your question in a very long-winded manner.
Very long. Where did you get your name from?
That's a good question. Do you already know this?
I think I've asked the question before.
Okay.
But I was probably looking through all the stuff that you have.
I stole it from Stephen King.
Oh.
So
So thank you, Stephen King.
Thanks, Stephen King. When I was trying to think up names for my comic company, I had a piece of paper that I was actually scrawling things on. And I was using the Dark Tower, The Gunslinger, which is the first book of the Dark Tower series, as a backing board for the piece of paper.
What were some other names that you would come up with before that? Possible names.
Don't even know. Doesn't even matter. Anyway.
Sure, I bet there were some dumb ones. People want to hear it.
I had the paper turned in a way that it was covering up the gun part of Gunslinger. And I had just kind of seen Dark Slinger, the juxtaposition there of the dark from Dark Tower with the slinger part. And so I was like, Darkslinger Comics. I like that. Now, in retrospect, I'm not entirely positive that I ultimately went with the right name. I mean, I love my company's name, and I have no plans to change it. But I don't know if I went with the right one merely because there are so many people who think that we are a horror comic only imprint.
That does kind of denote what it would be.
Yes.
When I first heard it, that's what I thought.
El Bovine Muerte is definitely not a horror comic. No. And quite a few of the things I've created are not horror comics. But I don't think that your name has to be indicative of what you publish for life. You know, there are a lot of companies that have really strange names. I mean, Dark Horse, what's that name all about? I'm guessing that has something to do with they're not like the mainstream publishers, right? But then I would assume too. But then how did they find fame? It was by acting like the mainstream publishers and licensing every product that they possibly could.
Just playing the game.
Yeah. But does the name necessarily fit?
Not quite.
Not quite. I mean, when you see stuff like Yosagi Yojimbo with the Dark Horse logo, does that 100% fit? No. But you're okay with it now because you understand what Dark Horse is, the company. So I think the more that I grow Darkslinger, the less I'm going to have to worry about that. But I do produce a lot that would be in the horror genre. So I don't know that it's necessarily a bad thing overall, as that probably is the genre I produce the most stuff in. Or at least inspired by. As I definitely wouldn't say Ghost Assassin is horror either, but it has supernatural elements. And supernatural often gets put into the horror genre.
Yeah, they can kind of go hand in hand. So, how many books of yours do you currently have?
You mean in print?
Yeah.
Okay.
Or no, how many have you created?
I created?
Yeah. That you have put into print.
That I've created that I put into print. Just stuff that I personally created or anything that's gone under the Darkslinger publishing title.
Things that you've created yourself.
Okay. So I wouldn't count Who Will Save the World in that then?
No.
Okay. So even though I wrote 90% of the dialogue.
I guess since it was more you.
Okay. So
yeah, including Who Will Save the World, everything that you've touched.
Okay. So let's see. I published 4 different issues of Ghost Assassin so far. But I actually think that my marketing strategy for that hasn't been correct. So this year, I'm actually looking to rectify that by the end of the year. So by the end of 2017, I want to rectify that fact. I've done 4 issues of that. I've done 6 issues of Chronicles of Von Helsing. I've done 4 sketchbooks. I put out 1 issue of The Principalities, but I'm currently revising that. I've done 4 issues of El Bovine Muerte, 1 issue of The Pauper, the Who Will Save the World graphic novel. I put out a little mini comic that was a Kickstarter exclusive for Who Will Save the World that's called Down Stone Cold that I re-dialogued. That was a project with Stefano Carticelli. Originally, that one was going to be included as a backup in Ghost Assassin, and it might find its way into a backup for something at some point, but I've actually changed what's going to be the backup in the first issue of Ghost Assassin. 3 sketchbooks that were Kickstarter exclusive sketchbooks. I put out 2 different hardcovers. The one was just a straight across hardcover edition of Who Will Save the World plus the sketchbook that was Kickstarter exclusive. That was a Kickstarter exclusive edition. And a hardcover of Chronicles Von Helsing number 1 through 3 plus the sketchbook for that was also a Kickstarter exclusive. And the Piper is a short story I did, which was included in the Principalities Convention Edition as a backup tell. I've also edited and lettered a number of books that I'd had nothing to do with the creation beyond and besides that.
So out of your properties created, which one do you like the most?
Which one am I currently working on? Because whichever one it is, that's the one I like the most. If you ask me which one I relate to the most, oddly enough, that would be one that hasn't been released yet, but the first issue is complete. This is called Diary of a Dead Man, where I'm working with the extremely talented Marco Roblin, doing the artwork for that one. That one is very oddly the most relatable one to me.
I've been waiting on that one because I like the artwork.
But where that one is the most relatable, the easiest one for me to do is actually Ghost Assassin. Ghost Assassin is incredibly easy for me to write. It's super simple for me to get into the world and get into the headset of David, the main character. It's easy for me to get into the headset of Todd, who is the what would you call secondary character, I guess? If David's the primary character, then Todd would be the secondary. He's David's foil character.
Yeah, you can't have one without the other.
Right. And Todd is in every scene that David is in, because Todd's dead and he is linked to David. And so he's in every scene that David's in. It's easy to write those characters. So that book, the main characters are David, who is the actual hitman, Todd, who's his best dead friend who follows him around everywhere, Melissa, who's also dead. She's a ghost. She's David's love interest. Brooke, who is basically like, what do you call a hitman's job coordinator? Their handler, I guess.
Yeah, handler's probably
Yeah,
a good word.
I guess the best term for her is she's David's handler. And then Scotty, who is Melissa's still living son. Those are the main characters in that universe. And that one is simple for me to write.
So your favorite is only the one whichever you're working on.
Whatever I am currently working on is my favorite. So if I were writing a Chronicles of Von Helsing story right now, chances are that would be my favorite. If I'm working on the Principalities right now, then that one is my favorite. Whatever I'm currently working on is my favorite.
Which one's your least favorite?
My least favorite? Out of those that I created?
Yeah.
I don't know if I'd say it's my least favorite, but the Pauper is definitely the most difficult to write. It's really hard one to write, mainly because I have such a specific vision of how it ends and how it should begin. But the middle part of it has become so fluid over the years of writing it that it keeps changing and changing and changing and changing. And each time seems to be for the best. It keeps getting to be a better and better and better story. But I'm still not totally happy to the point where I would look for an artist to start doing that, because I know that the second, third, fourth, and fifth issues are probably going to be dramatically changed prior to going to artwork again on that one. I made a mistake by going to artwork on it the first time, which is why it was released as a rough cut instead of an issue number 1. But that's not my least favorite. It's just the most difficult to work on.
Now, I don't know if it's commonplace in the world of writing comics as you do, but
I will say when I did the dialogue for Who Will Save the World, it was really hard to do the narrative dialogue on that one because I didn't create that character. And it is a lot more difficult for me to get in the mindset of a character that I didn't create. I don't know how they should speak the same way. You know, like I know my character's dialogue inside and out. I know exactly the type of things Lay Mime would do in any given situation.
You can't put words to someone else's character.
Not nearly as easy. I mean, I can do it. I've written stories back when I was pitching Marvel all the time. You know, I've written stories that had like the X-Men in it and things like that. And I found, you know, I could do the dialogue pretty well. But overall, each new writer that takes over on a property, I think a character loses a little bit more at times. There are definitely creators who take properties and they gain a ton. I mean, you know, you look at like Batman when Denny O'Neil and Neil Adams took over and, you know, made him legitimately the Dark Knight. You know, Batman appeared at nighttime and, you know, they added a ton to him when they did that and took him out of the campy era. So obviously they really knew the character's voice, but me personally, I do find it difficult to find the voice of characters that I did not create. Or maybe I'm just not as interested in it.
So I don't know if it's common or not, but do people, when you're writing, do they ever write with other people? Like you collaborate on,
Some people
on
do.
one thing.
Some people do, like Ben Kreger, who you know, who's my co-host from the Comic Collaborative podcast. He collaborates with Edward Ellsworth on the writing for Black Suit of Death. Do I collaborate with other writers? I bought a plot from a gentleman, Michael. I'm drawing a blank on his last name right now. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to look that up later. I'll put it in the show notes. But I bought a plot from him for a Ghost Assassin story. But because his take on my characters wasn't really who my characters were, I just used the plot, and I really, really like the plot that he came up with. I used it and went over it and revised it and made it into my characters. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Which, when I talked to him about it, you know, he completely understood what I meant. It's not like it's insulting to do that. I've tried collaborating with other writers on a few things. Probably the closest I've came to it is either Who Will Save the World, because, the artwork was done and Stefano had written what I would call a soft script, which means that he had put dialogue in there. But basically, I'm going in and adding flourishes, things like that. But with Who Will Save the World, I wrote probably 90 to 95% of the dialogue because it didn't have any narrative dialogue in there. So I wrote all of that into there. And I would take that as writing collaboration in a way. There's a short story that I'll be coming out with in the next couple of years called Carnival that I collaborated with Ty Wakefield of Captain Cure, who passed on a few years back. I collaborated with him on that story. I'm not sure if other people do it the same way I've done it, because like with him, we were going somewhere and he pitched me a story idea and said, take this and turn it into something. So that's exactly what I did. I was like, oh, okay, you're kind of painting a picture in my head. So I took it and a couple days later sat down at my computer and banged out a 12-page story. He wanted it to be 10 to 12 pages. It was originally going to be put into his alternate reality comics mini stories, and then he actually wanted to do a team up between our companies called Dark Reality, where it would be Darkslinger Comics and alternate reality doing an anthology, and he wanted that one to be like the flagship of that anthology, which would have been amazing, but unfortunately osteosarcoma type cancer he had different ideas there. But with that, the collaboration was kind of strange because, Ty hit me with all these ideas, and Ty was always like 500 ideas a minute, right? He hits me with all these ideas, and maybe I didn't hear it all. Maybe he didn't say it all. We had some arguments on which one that was. But when he got it, he sends it back to me, or he sends me back his notes, and he's like, "Where's the detective?" And I'm like, "What detective?" And he's like, "Well, there's supposed to be a detective in here, so this can be a recurring story." I was like, I thought this was just going to be a 12-page one and done. And so we had some differing opinions on what that should be, because I thought adding a detective would make it too goofy, add in too many tired cliches, because, not every story needs the beat cop detective coming in, so on and so forth, And he very much loved cliches. Like, his favorite era of comics was the 60s, which is nothing but a bunch of cliches. So he wanted me to add in some of those elements. But the basic idea that he came up with is still what that story ended up being. So I would definitely view that as writer collaboration, but it's not something I've done to any great deal. I would say I've collaborated more with my artists on story ideas, because sometimes you'll send a script and the artist will read it and they'll be sending you the roughs, which is what you get when they've kind of thumbnailed out everything. And once in a while, one of my artists will send something where they'll have added a whole new panel or a whole new page, or taken one page and made it into two. They'll send a note. They can do it the way I wrote it if I want to, but they think it works a lot better this way. And most of the time, they've been right.
So most of your collaboration comes from your artists.
Correct.
Yeah. They just have a different way of viewing things.
Yes.
They see it in pictures. You see it in words, almost.
No, I do see it in pictures, because I started drawing long before I started writing. I actually wanted to be a comic artist when I was a kid, but in 1997, I got in a really bad head-on collision that shattered my right wrist, and I'm right-handed. So after 1997, I couldn't hold a pencil or a pen or a paintbrush in a way that would actually allow me to draw. You have given me a good idea, though, for a question that I should ask Ben on our podcast, because I'm actually curious what it's like for other writers to collaborate with writers versus just artists. Because that is something I'm personally interested in knowing more about. I don't know if it's anything I'd really be overly interested in doing in my career. I like writing in a solitary fashion, but I'm not saying that I would never ever collaborate. And sometimes when you're editing other people's books, you're editing the story, you are doing writer collaboration to a degree. Because one of the things they may need you for is they keep bumping their head against the wall trying to figure out how the story works. And you might come in, read it, and in one reading say, oh, okay, here's what you need to do. Move this around, do this, lose this, and bam, the story will flow from there. And that is collaborative writing to a degree, right?
Yeah. Or pretty much you're working with other people.
Yeah.
And you're helping them write their own thing, or they're helping you write your own thing. It's a little bit of collaboration. It's not quite like you wrote it together.
I was doing a collaborative piece with a gentleman, very, very good guy named Dino Caruso, who did at the time own Caruso Comics. I'm not sure if that's still around or not. I briefly collaborated on a Ghost Assassin story with Dino, and it was fun collaborating with him. The only problem is that as I got more into the Ghost Assassin storyline, I figured out that where we were going with that particular story wasn't where I wanted to go with the overall story I was telling in Ghost Assassin. So I had to axe it, but it was still a lot of fun and a good process. I hope Dino got something out of it. But that's probably the closest I've came to collaborating with other writers.
It sounds about as collaborative as you can get.
Yeah.
I mean, when I think collaborative, I think...
Yeah, it's too bad that what we did won't get published. But who knows, maybe... I'm not sure if I still have that script or not, but if I do, and Dino's okay with it, maybe I'll release it by blog post one day or something like that.
Yeah, to me, when I think collaboration, it's both of, like, two or more people. They're sitting down, and they're writing it together.
The way we did it on that one, because he lives in Canada, and I live in Oregon... There was a story taking place in that issue of Ghost Assassin where some of it happened in the present and then some of it happened in the past. And I would write this story, or 4 to 7 pages, however many you need to be, that was happening in the past. And then I would send it to Dino, who would then write like the 4 to 5 pages that were happening in the present. And back and forth, and we just kept emailing back and forth to one another like that.
What's the next thing you're going to put out?
The next thing I'm going to put out is going to actually be a newly revised Ghost Assassin #1.
Starting all over?
Yes and no. Starting over in a bigger way, not starting the storyline over. So initially, when I first did Ghost Assassin, what people may not know is that there is a legitimate reason that story only clocks in at 12 pages. Ghost Assassin Prelude. When I first did that, there was this anthology that was going called Digital Webbing Presents that had a pay-to-play formula. Do you know what that is?
Pay-to-play formula. I would assume you pay money and they let you in on something.
Yeah. If your story got accepted, then you basically paid whatever the amount was for the printing of those particular pages you were in. And then, everybody got released in this anthology. And there were a lot of seriously good properties that went through Digital Webbing Presents. They did an issue that had the Ninja Turtles in it. Do you know Eric Powell's The Goon?
The Goon?
Mm-hmm. One of the best comics ever published. If you haven't read it, I'm going to have to get you some copies.
I'm not sure.
Okay. Well, The Goon was featured in Digital Webbing Presents. I'm not sure if it had already been picked up by Dark Horse yet or not when they did, but there's been a lot of really good things that went through there. Well, anyway, when I first did Ghost Assassin, I didn't know exactly what I was going to do with it, but I had this 10 pages I was really happy with, so I thought, hey, I'll put this in Digital Webbing Presents if they accept it, and just kind of see if anyone actually likes the story I'm telling. Because one of the things you'll find when you're first creating comics, or creating anything for that matter, is that you have this, I wouldn't necessarily call it a fear, but you have this thought in the back of your head that no one's going to get what you're creating, right? And that wasn't anything I was really afraid of necessarily, because if you put something out and no one gets it, no one likes it, who cares? You're in the exact same boat you were, minus, whatever the fees were to get the project going, right? So at that point, you can either decide, creating comics isn't for me, or I'm going to try harder the next time, right? But I just kind of wanted to see what people thought about this, right? So I got everything all ready, and I was about ready to submit. And then it was announced that there were only going to be something like 6 more issues of Digital Webbing Presents. The guy who published it had announced that it was going to cease publication. For some reason, it might have just been low sales, or maybe it was just too time consuming, because he is a letterer in the comics field that does a lot of work. So he might have just been too busy to put it all together. I did end up buying an advertisement in one of the final issues, just to advertise Ghost Assassin. And so when I printed it up, it was a story that was just meant to be a little standalone introduction that would be in an anthology, just to see if people even like this story, right? Well, when the anthology folded, it left me with a question of what exactly am I going to do with this story? So luckily for me, around that time, a print-on-demand company named Kablam had started up, and so had one named Comics Press, that were doing digital print runs of comics that you could do as few as just one. And as I mentioned earlier in the podcast, I printed up 50 copies, they sold through, so on and so forth. But one of the things is that little Ghost Assassin story, that was a 12-page book. 10 pages of story, 2 pinups. Never went offset with it, never anything like that. I just saw it as building up my fan base, right? The next one I did, I actually quite hate. Because one of the problems I experienced was Ghost Assassin Prelude was too well received. It actually scared me a little bit how much people liked it.
That's not a problem, though.
It is a problem. It's a problem when you go to write the next story and you're so afraid of screwing up whatever it was that people liked about the last issue that you end up totally screwing up everything everybody liked about the last issue, because you have that in your head instead of just creating something that you want to create. So I basically did everything wrong with Ghost Assassin Origin. And I realized it when I was selling about the 50th copy, ended up pulling all the copies. So I have since went back and have redone that story. It originally only clocked in at 8 pages. Now that's 14 pages, which will appear as the backup tell in Ghost Assassin number 2. And so I think the basic idea for that storyline was still a good one. I just don't think I was ready to tell it yet. So, flash forward a few years, and I was still a little bit afraid to do Ghost Assassin, honestly. But I had done a crossover with Alan Bennett of Black Box Comics with our characters, David and Todd from Ghost Assassin, and his character, Johnny Vega. We just did kind of a little for fun crossover comic. I was reading his comics, and just for some odd reason thought, hey, wouldn't it be fun if his future space guy traveled to the past and met David from Ghost Assassin, and then all this stuff happened that would affect the world of Johnny Vega. So we did that as a little mini comic that we released, and then I had done a Kickstarter in the early days of Kickstarter. I'm going to say this was 2010, I believe, for Ghost Assassin Mercy, which was a much bigger story. If I remember right, Ghost Assassin Mercy clocked in at 22 pages. And I have a different artist on that one, Joel Kotajar, who would end up doing Ghost Assassin for the next several issues. Joel's a phenomenal artist. I could not ask for a better artist to be working on Ghost Assassin, in my opinion. Ghost Assassin Mercy was actually something that I started writing while I was in Ty's hospital room with him. So, Ty's now widow had given me a call and had told me that he was going to be taken to the Seattle Cancer Care Center because his lungs were deflating and they couldn't deal with it in Idaho. We'd known for a few days that he was doing pretty poorly. But I had driven to the hospital, and I was in his room, and I was just kind of, sitting there watching him, shooting the shit with him. And if you've never watched somebody die of cancer, it's a horrible thing. Absolutely horrible thing. And throughout the whole night, he kept jumping out of bed, not knowing where he was at. And something just sparked in me to start creating. And I created this story that's now known as Ghost Assassin Mercy, that's about a guy who hires David to humanely kill his mom, who's dying of cancer. And when I had written this story, I was actually kind of afraid of it. It's a really good story, but can you release a book like that? I mean,
It's a tough question. Some people
that
might find
story,
it a little bit morbid.
Yeah, they might find it morbid, they might find it offensive.
Yeah.
So I'd written the whole thing, and luckily, Ty did not pass away at that point. Unfortunately, he did about a year after that. But he did pull through. They were able to reinflate his lung. He was talking to me about a month later. He started to feel better. I wouldn't say 100%, but he was feeling better. And asked me, what I was working on. And I told him about this story that I had started when I was in his hospital room. And I sent it over to him. And he read it and told me that I have to release it. It's a story that he wanted me to release. He said, don't worry about it. If anybody gets offended by it, then they've never actually had to deal with anybody dying of cancer. So I said, okay, so that one is going to see release. I did a Kickstarter for it, but at the time, I can't really say I understood fully how Kickstarter worked. It was still a really, really new platform, and I was just kind of using it just to see if you could actually get any funding on it. So I did a Kickstarter to cover a very, very small run of Ghost Assassin Mercy through a print-on-demand company, and I met the goal and got out some really cool little incentives too. I printed up a small run for conventions, which sold out pretty quickly. And about a month later, I was going to Emerald City Comic Con, and the printer I was dealing with at the time, for some reason, could not turn around color copies fast enough for me to be able to take any of them. But they could black and white pages. Now, I, to this day, have no clue why that was. It shouldn't take any more time to print color than it should black and white with the technology they're using, because they're using the exact same sort of printers.
Just a printer, it's color or it's not.
Right, but I decided to go ahead and just do a black and white convention edition. And so I put a little round logo on the cover of Ghost Assassin Mercy that said convention exclusive, made the pages black and white, had them print up some copies that I sold at cons. To this day, it's never seen a large print run. So when I do what I would call the soft relaunch of the Ghost Assassin series, I'm not actually changing much about it. The one thing I'm changing is Joel did a new cover for a #1 issue that I think is really phenomenal. It has David crouched down with a sniper rifle, and then in little scope sights you can see the other 4 main characters, which I was a little bit hesitant to do a picture of Scotty in a scope sight because he is only 8, but then it was pointed out to me that just because David's holding a sniper rifle doesn't necessarily mean those scopes are his looking at, his friends, which is true. And then I had a little bit less of a problem with it, but I still kind of think, we have a 8-year-old with a sight sighted on him on the cover. That's, not fully cool.
No,
but
offensive to some.
Yeah, it's a little bit offensive to even myself, honestly. But
you offend myself.
I offend myself. But, we're doing a new cover for that, and I have once again revised the logo, because the logo on Ghost Assassin is something that's not really going to be fully set until we have that big offset printer. I keep screwing around with it. I keep messing around with it, which is pretty common with logos. It's not very often that you hit, the absolute perfect logo the first time out. Although Tony did do that with the Chronicles Von Helsing logo. He created that logo, not me. And, right from the get-go, it's awesome looking, yet simplistic. It's everything a logo needs to be.
You want to mention real quick who Tony is?
Tony Morgan, the cover artist on Chronicles Von Helsing #1 through 5, the interior artist of Chronicles Von Helsing #1. He also owns Gun Baby, which he has published a fantastic book that he wrote and drew called Chicken Leg Bone Boy through. And he's done some other books through there as well, Throwing Bones. So with Ghost Assassin #1, what I'm planning on doing is taking Ghost Assassin Mercy and putting it in as the first part of this book, and then Ghost Assassin Prelude, which was only 10 pages, if you recall, and putting it as the backup to this book. Now, I really don't want to sell the same thing to people twice, so when I get set to release this, I am planning on just sending out free copies to the people who backed the Ghost Assassin Mercy Kickstarter, because I think it would be very unfair if they had to purchase that twice. So, for the second issue, I'm going to be including Ghost Assassin in the Cards, which is a 16-page story, and then the newly revised Ghost Assassin Origin, which is a 14-page story. And Ghost Assassin in the Cards, our listeners might be familiar with the image because I've been using it on the internet for quite a while. It's David pointing a gun towards the reader with a crystal ball on the table in front of him and several ghosts standing behind him. It's a fantastic image, very well drawn by Joel Kodajar and beautifully colored by Cecilia De La Cruz.
Yeah, I've seen that one quite a bit.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very good cover.
Yes, and then issue #3, I have the pencils fully done for the cover and all the interior pages, and that one is just going to have one story in it that is known as Ghost Assassin: The Dig. It bridges a little bit more of David's history, but does a lot to move the book forward too. Because one of the things I had problems with for the first few years after creating Ghost Assassin was, how exactly do you do a book that the protagonist of is not a good guy? Because, if you read comics a lot, you read like comics based on Thanos or Magneto or any of the superhero, supervillain type guys. Whenever they do a supervillain like Deadpool, they always make him into a good guy. Maybe they don't want to straight up say they're a good guy. Maybe they still want to call him a villain, but they're always turned into good guys, right?
Anti-hero is what
Anti-heroes,
they like to call them.
yeah, vigilantes, whatever you want to call them. Ghost Assassin is not a superhero book, but there are certain tropes that get used in every type of storytelling. And generally, when you are doing a story, the protagonist always has to be good because that's what's considered relatable, right? But if you watch Sopranos, it proved that it didn't have to be that way. Because Tony Soprano might have done good things, but at heart, he wasn't really a good guy. And I wouldn't say David's necessarily a bad guy, but he's not a good one either. And I really didn't want to make him into a good guy. And so a lot of the stories I came up with initially, he didn't skate the thin line enough for me. So it took a few years to kind of refine it. I knew who David was, and these stories I kept trying to put him in weren't his stories, because they were stories that kept having to make him into a good person, And that wasn't the story I actually wanted to tell about him.
So bottom line, your next book release will be Ghost Assassin.
Will be Ghost Assassin. I'm
Re-release.
planning on returning to Kickstarter to do a funding campaign for Ghost Assassin #1, which this time is going to be offset printing, because I actually want to go big distribution with it finally. And if I am able to do that, going through a bigger distribution channel means being able to put out more copies in a more timely fashion. And Kickstarter hopefully will give me the fundage I need in order to do that. Because to do a print run of anything, above 1,000 copies is going to cost you quite a bit of money. So if I can get the funds through Kickstarter to be able to release at least issue #1 through Diamond, which is the major distribution channel in comics, then that should help me to be able to get issue #2 and 3 out at a rapid pace, #4, so on and so forth. And so at the moment, it's incredibly imperative to just focus as much attention as I possibly can on Ghost Assassin. I have other stories for Chronicles of Von Helsing, Principalities, The Pauper, so on and so forth, that are ready to be illustrated, but I don't want to work on those until after I get Ghost Assassin back in order. This title was supposed to be my flagship title, and I've now at this point actually published less copies of it than 2 of my other titles. So while I'm getting Ghost Assassin back in order, I do also need to get El Bovine Muerte back up and running, which I currently have an artist who is working on a 7-page little story where, spoiler alert, Lay Mime is filming a pro-smoking commercial.
Sounds like something he would do.
Yes, it just sounds like something Lay Mime would do. And meanwhile, some people are trying to stop him from making his pro-smoking commercial because obviously you don't want to make a pro-smoking commercial.
A big part, I think, from someone that came into the world of comics from very far outside of it.
Mm-hmm. Very far outside of it, meaning what?
Meaning I didn't read comics. I didn't consider comics.
Okay.
Because I don't know why. They were just picture books pretty much to me for a while, or just completely off my radar.
It's also important to say that during the era you grew up and there wasn't easy access to them too.
No, it didn't seem like a medium that was pushed onto us.
Because when you were a kid, libraries had not yet really embraced comics. And while Comic Cons were starting to take off, they weren't things that, just people went to just for fun, which, now that they do, it's debatable on how many of those people actually end up buying comics while they're there. But I'd still say there's a pretty healthy number of people that are buying comics at Comic Cons.
I think so.
But, Marvel and DC had largely pulled out of the newsstand market and went direct market only. So unless you just casually found yourself in a comic shop one day, there was really not too many ways that you were going to just be randomly introduced to comics. I had pitched Principalities to Diamond about 2 years ago, and it got rejected. And on the rejection, they checked 2 boxes, right? One of them said the inking, which I thought was really stupid and don't agree with at all, because why would you reject a book based off the inking unless somebody had just taken like a black pen and just colored the whole page in ink? If you've ever seen what passes as mainstream comics, the inking is lacking in quite a few of them. I'll just put it that way. So I would say the inking in Principalities is on par with a lot of the stuff that Dark Horse or Image releases. But the second thing they checked off when Diamond declined on carrying Principalities at the time was the pacing of the story. And it took me 2 years to really figure out what was off with the pacing of that story. It was kind of eating at the back of my brain, like, is there something off with the pacing of the story? Or is Diamond just looking for a reason not to carry an independent comic? But after about 2 years, whether or not they were right, it inspired me to do better with the story. And so I now have a completely different pace set for it. I have 2 issues done of the way it was previously set up that I've been thinking I might kind of revise and recut to be in issue number 0 that I'll either give away at conventions or will be like a convention edition. But I'm actually pretty much totally revising the type of writing I did when I did those first 2 issues. Because the first 2 issues really read more like a team superhero book than what it is, which is a book about angels and demons and gods and so I wanted all that to shine through a whole lot more. So I've revised it, changed up the pacing.
Yeah, it's a cool topic.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it can be difficult to pull off.
Yeah, especially when you're dealing with a cast as big as what's in Principalities. Because there are something like 16 to 17 characters that I have to check in with every couple of issues.
That's quite big.
It is. But it's necessary for the story that I'm telling. Principality is going to get out there one way or the other. If Diamond declines it on the second go-round, I'll print it up and be doing convention editions until it's big enough to, do trade paperbacks and see if they'll carry those.
Yeah, rejection is part of the comic game.
It is. I've received many rejection letters. I have a whole stack of them from Marvel from when I first started out.
I think anyone that works in it has a giant stack of rejection letters.
Mm-hmm. If they don't, then they haven't tried that hard. Or they only do their own stuff. And they just distribute it themselves. So that's all for today. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this and want to hear more, you can come back next Monday. We will be doing a new podcast every Monday. If you want to learn more about Darkslinger Comics, you can visit www.darkslinger.com. You can find us on Instagram, Twitter, Tumblr, Pinterest, Facebook. On Facebook, we have fan pages for Darkslinger Comics, Ghost Assassin, El Bovine Muerte, and Chronicles Von Helsing. Did I miss any social media?
I think that's about it.
Okay.
I'm not big onto the social media, so you might have left off one or two.
Okay. So, for the Darkslinger Mafia podcast, I'm Adam Watson.
Robert Diaz.
Thank you for listening.